Destroying Tehran's suspected ability to make a nuclear weapon was one of the main goals of the US and Israel's attack on Iran.
One is to break completely their nuclear program.
When crazy people have nuclear weapons, bad things happen.
But have they achieved that goal? And for the longest time, possessing nuclear weapons was seen as a form of deterrence, a way to ensure your territorial integrity against bigger powers. So would Iran have been safer if it had already had nuclear weapons? What message does the war send to other countries? Are we at the start of a new arms race?
I don't think we're in a new arms race yet. We could be on the precipice of a new arms race in light of the events that are happening and in light of the policies of the Trump administration.
Dr. Farzan Sabet is with us today. He is a managing researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute and an expert on issues of nuclear security, disarmament, and the big ideas behind building sustainable peace. So let's dive in with some clarity on the facts. The US and Israel claimed Iran was close to possessing a nuclear weapon. Was it?
So had the Islamic Republic decided to pursue a nuclear weapon, it could have very quickly acquired weapons-grade uranium based on its existing large stockpile of high-enriched uranium. However, the process to actually build a nuclear explosive device and put it on a delivery vehicle would have taken longer, potentially months more. Some estimate placed it as far out as maybe a year. And in terms of then doing serialized production of nuclear weapons, that could have taken up to 2 years. So although Iran had many of the key elements to build a bomb ready to go, the actual process of building it would have taken months, and in terms of large-scale production, years. And with the current war, its ability to break out has been severely degraded, although this is a capacity that it can build back with relatively high speed given the right resources and time.
And that's time the Iranian regime will likely get, according to Dr. Sabet. He warns Iran could double down on its efforts to develop a nuclear weapon to bolster its defenses.
I think it's quite likely that the Islamic Republic will survive the war. And once that happens and the war is over, it'll be clear that the existing pillars of Iran's deterrence doctrine have failed. What were those pillars? Nuclear threshold status, which we've already discussed, missiles, and we can add perhaps drones to that, and of course its network of proxy actors within the axis of resistance. The Islamic Republic will come to the conclusion that while certain elements of its doctrine succeeded, namely its ability to constrain traffic, namely energy traffic, through the Strait of Hormuz. Once your adversary feels confident enough to attack you without fearing the consequences, it nonetheless still means that your deterrence failed. So what the Islamic Republic is declaring now, and it will seek to do, is to have this, in its view, hopefully be the last major war that it experiences. And so one step in this direction that it'll take to create this post-war reality, I think would likely be to more seriously either pursue the option to build nuclear weapons.
But if the Iranian regime falls in this war, what then?
For example, let's say the country becomes fragmented and falls into a state of chaos. It becomes quite possible that elements of the former regime, including the IRGC and the broader nuclear establishment, seek to build nuclear weapons or become proliferators. We have, for example, in the case of Pakistan, the Abdul Khan network, which, using Pakistan's nuclear industrial base, became a major exporter of nuclear technology that became the foundations of many other nuclear programs, including facilitating and supporting Iran's nuclear program. So it's possible that we now have a new super proliferation network, sending out and sharing or selling that technology either for ideological reasons or for profit. You could see the establishment of a new regime which would seek to create a status quo which is much more sustainable. For example, ending or reducing the level of conflict with foreign countries and attempting to rebuild Iran's much battered economy, which is under sanctions, in part due to the nuclear program. So it could forego the nuclear program or for example, seek a kind of a symbolic acknowledgement of its right to enrich and possession of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is really the key element for both, a key element for both peaceful, it's kind of a self-reliant peaceful nuclear program, including an energy program, but also nuclear weapons, but forego the much larger and expansive nuclear program of the Islamic Republic, which gave it a substantive nuclear weapons option, and submit to International Atomic Energy Agency inspections, monitoring, surveillance, and transparency measures, so to kind of signal its peaceful intentions in terms of its nuclear program. I think all of these scenarios are potentially on the table. One hopes that it'll be the latter, but we should be aware and keep our eyes open for the other scenarios as well.
The effort to stop the spread of nuclear technologies and nuclear weapons began in the 1960s. A treaty for non-nuclear proliferation, or NPT for short, was signed in 1968, over 2 decades after world leaders and human rights groups fought to prevent tragedies like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
At 10:58, the morning of August 9th, the bomb was exploded above the city, and in the towering mushroom, Japan could read its doom.
So after the U.S.'s use of the first nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a race by a large number of countries to pursue nuclear weapons, including at the time the Soviet Union, then the People's Republic of China, the United Kingdom, and France. By the 1950s and 60s, many of these countries came to possess very large nuclear stockpiles, in some cases numbering in the tens of thousands of weapons at each. There was a recognition that nuclear war, should it ever break out, could be potentially devastating, not only for the countries targeted, but for life and existence on the planet Earth, setting back human civilization, possibly back to the Stone Age, depending on how far a nuclear war advanced.
Let's go back to the idea of deterrence. Many countries have tried different forms of negotiation with the United States, a nuclear power, and failed. But the one that did succeed might just surprise you.
The historical lessons are very difficult to ignore. So you have, for example, the case of Iraq in 2002, which was invaded in part for the pretext of possessing nuclear weapons, which we now know is not the case. Well, Iraq was alleged to have a nuclear program, didn't have a nuclear program, was invaded, had the regime overthrown, and suffered years of civil war and internal conflict and chaos, which to some extent continues to this day. Then you have the experience of Libya, which after the invasion of Iraq decided to negotiate with the United States and the United Kingdom, give up its nuclear program, and normalize ties with the Western powers. After the start of the Arab Spring and uprisings within Libya itself, lacking a substantive deterrent against foreign intervention, NATO intervened in that conflict, severely degraded the Libyan military, and facilitated the collapse of that regime, the death of its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, and the outbreak of a civil war, which again has left Libya fragmented. And although some semblance of peace and order has been restored, the country remains divided, and the threat of a resumption of civil war is certainly there. Then you have the case of Iran today, which built a very advanced nuclear threshold status, but it didn't build nuclear weapons. And part of that, of course, was the difficulty of doing it, given that Iran as a country is very heavily infiltrated by both Western and Israeli intelligence. But nonetheless, its decision was to be a very advanced nuclear threshold state, but not to cross that line. Again, clearly, that wasn't sufficient. So that model also failed. Then you have the case of North Korea, which did successfully build nuclear weapons. And of course, that's given it a deterrent, which likely forecloses the possibility of future, at least large-scale military interventions like those experienced by Iraq, Libya, and Iran.
Even here in the European Union, debate around nuclear weapons has gained pace. Since the war in Ukraine began in February 2022, European leaders have been worried about a nuclear-armed Russia. Security guarantees from long-standing ally the United States have also waned, and American promises made to Gulf countries are also on shaky ground.
As the perceived reliability of the U.S. declines, and we can see that, for example, in the case of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the Arab monarchies surrounding the Persian Gulf, which, as recently as a few months ago, were given had pre-existing strong security and arms relationships with the U.S. But in the case of a country like, for example, Qatar, were given additional security assurances in the form of, for example, an executive order, with the assumption that when the U.S. conducted its foreign policy and military operations in the region, it would do so with the security of those countries in mind. Well, that clearly didn't happen in the case of the current war that we're experiencing. So whether you're a U.S. ally in the GCC, whether you're a U.S. ally in East Asia, like South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, or whether you're a U.S. ally in the West, including in the European Union, a country like Germany, you're going to be thinking much more about how to assure your own security, whether that's through expanding the military industrial base, the network of partnerships with other like-minded countries, but you're also going to be thinking about potential nuclear weapons options. And after this war, and with the events that are like to come in the future of this administration, for example, threatening the territories and territorial integrity by the U.S. of even its partners, right, like Denmark and Greenland, I think many minds will move even further towards considering nuclear weapons deterrence and how that can be created to ensure their security.
The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists say this is the most dangerous moment in human history, more dangerous than during the Cold War, and expiring nuclear agreements are one of the reasons behind it. Dr. Sabet says nuclear power can be a force for good, a force of peace, but it depends entirely on the hands that wield it.
It's possible that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by some set of actors would, in fact, move security in a certain region or the war more broadly towards, for example, greater diplomacy and a greater tendency towards peace, while the acquisition of nuclear weapons by other actors could create deterrence still, but like we said before, to the extent that they're less financially or technically capable to maintaining those nuclear deterrents, increase the risks of accidental nuclear accidents, to the extent that the countries are not well governed and the foreign and security policies are not well managed, increase the risk of nuclear war, and of course, nuclear proliferation. For example, if you get an actor which acquires much greater deterrence through the possession of nuclear weapons, that forecloses the possibility of, for example, maybe a large-scale war against that country, but it could enhance the aggression and destabilizing behavior of that country towards others. So there are dangers all around, and not necessarily any easy solutions.
The Iran war has raised big questions on international security and what it takes to keep countries out of war. Join us next time for a look at another facet. I'm Nehal Johari. Thanks for watching.